Gentlemen, welcome to the special council meeting of Thursday, November 18th, 2021. Special council meeting to deal with an overview of the 2022 budget. I'll call the meeting to order. I'll ask for a motion, please, for the adoption of the agenda. Councillor Dunn and Councillor Vale, all in favor? And that's passed. And is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest on today's agenda? Seeing none, and I will mention that we have myself and Councillor Vale and Dunn in council chambers, and we have Councillors Ashmore, Elmsley, and Richardson on Zoom for this meeting. So we have our quorum. Item 4 is presentations. So we have a presentation and overview of the 2022 budget for the City of Kawartha Lakes. Jennifer Stover, our Director of Corporate Services, is going to lead us through that. So I will turn it over to you, Jennifer. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the presentation today, we're going to start by looking at a financial overview of the period 2019 to 2022. And that's the term of this council. By approving this budget, this will be the last budget that this council gets to see. So we'll talk about what council has accomplished in this 4-year term. We'll talk about the pandemic response and recovery. And then finally, we'll talk about the 2022 proposed budgets. There's 5 of them. The capital budget and operating budget are both tax supported. There's a special projects budget. And then the water and wastewater, there's both an operating and capital budget. So we'll start with the financial overview. As I mentioned, 2022 budget's the final budget for this term of council. And in a moment, we'll walk through some slides highlighting some of the key financial initiatives that this council has undertaken, and also take the opportunity to respond to some of the frequent comments we get about the city's finances. And these are comments that I've received. So our taxes are too high, we don't invest enough in our roads, we've got too many staff, the debt's too high, and that we should really be using our surpluses to lower taxes. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the key decisions that the council makes on those matters. So we'll start with just looking at the operating budget over the last 4 years. The 2 bar charts showing 2018, that was the final budget that the last council approved, and comparing to what the proposed 2022 budget looks like that this council will approve. And really what it's demonstrating with this chart is that not a lot has changed. So council has, in this term, continued to provide the 200+ services in a very consistent and effective manner to what was being done in the past. Some of the key initiatives that this council's undertaken over this term pertaining to the operating budget. So we introduced a special projects budget, and we'll talk about that a little later on. These were costs that are non-capital, one-time related expenditures, and were traditionally included in the operating budget, and we've pulled those out to provide some transparency about how those dollars were being spent. Council took the initiative to introduce 3 key reserves. WSIB, insurance, and winter maintenance are all areas where we see a lot of volatility and opportunity to have significant tax increases or decreases depending on what's happening in those areas. So we've set up a reserve to help mitigate that and to stabilize the tax levy. Recently partnered with Peterborough County on some shared services. There was an introduction of the $1 Million Makeover Program, which was to help support small businesses and revitalize the downtowns. And the final initiative, this council made the decision to support community paramedic program, and that was tax levy funded, and very recently we've got the announcement that the province is now actually going to fund that. So that was really great that this council was able to be a leader in that initiative. On the capital budget, over the 4-year term, there's been an investment of more than $160 million in the maintenance of the city's assets. Some of the highlights of that include the revitalization of 2 downtown areas, both Lindsay and Fenelon Falls. There's been the construction of the new fire station, the Mariposa Fire Station, 2 significant park projects, the Logie Park and the Bob Cajun Beach Park, which is currently underway. And the last bullet, I think, is probably what's of interest to most, is the investment of $72 million in rehabilitating almost 700 kilometers of roads. That's a key initiative. So if we flip to now talk about some of the key concerns that we hear from the residents, the first one being that our property taxes are too high. So in this chart, there's 3 bars. The teal-colored bar was our original 10-year financial plan that was approved in 2017 that showed that we would need a 4.5% tax levy increase for 4 years, 2018 to 2021, and then it staggered down, tapering off at 2% at the latter part of the 10-year plan. The dark blue bars was the plan in 2018 was amended, recognizing that we could drop that a little bit, and it took the tax levy increase from the 4.5% down to 4% for the remaining 3 years of those initial 4. And the red bar shows what this council actually approved as the tax levy increase. 2022 actually would be our proposed currently, and we'll talk about that increase throughout this presentation. But I thought what was interesting is council has given direction to staff in looking at a new long-term financial plan to put in a tax levy increase or assume a tax levy increase of about 3%. And so while the tax levy jumped up and down a little bit over this 4-year term of council, it actually averaged out to about 3%. And that seems to be a good target number for us to proceed with. So we'll talk a little bit more about property taxes and why we think our property taxes are too high. So there's some factors that we need to talk about first. Taxes are a complex matter. It starts with the assessed value of the property, which is determined by MPAC, and that greatly determines how much you pay in taxes. The other key item that needs to be factored is the mix of residential and non-residential properties, and you'll see in a comparison chart later how that plays in. Kawartha Lakes, obviously mostly residential, not as strong on the non-residential. The services that the municipality provides obviously contribute, and then the size, location, and population of the municipality. So this chart takes 40 municipalities and compares it to the city of Kawartha Lakes. And so what's interesting in this, Kawartha Lakes obviously has area rating depending on where in Kawartha Lakes you live. And so I've highlighted the two most common tax rates. Number 26 would be the taxes within Lindsay. Number 15 would be outside of Lindsay, and it predominantly covers Bobcaygeon, Fenland Falls, Omemee, those areas with the tax rate that they would pay. But I think what's most interesting, aside from the fact that we're in the middle of the chart, is when you look at sort of the top 10, they're all in the GTA, they're all very, very dense municipalities. Toronto obviously has lots of non-residential businesses that can help bring the tax levy down. They're helping to pay the taxes. And then when you look at the far end of the chart, you've got a lot of the more rural municipalities. Chatham-Kent, Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, Windsor. Well, Windsor, I guess, not rural, but North Bay, Sudbury. You've got more of that rural end. And so, I would think Kawartha Lakes would tend towards that farther end. But there we are right in the middle. So I don't think that our taxes are too high. I think that this council has been very responsible in setting the tax rate, and we're in a pretty good position compared to others. We also get the comment often that our roads aren't being maintained in the way that they should. And so this is a slide we've used before. Kawartha Lakes, a map of Kawartha Lakes obviously on the left. And on the right is a GPS map of driving the distance from Toronto to Florida. Or sorry, not Toronto, Kawartha Lakes to Florida. And what that shows is that Kawartha Lakes has as many lane kilometers of roads as what it would take to drive to Florida and back. So when you think about that, it helps to put into perspective just how many roads we have in the community. And it's not just about the roads. It's not just about potholes either. We hear that complaint often. But there's a lot more involved. It's the ditching, it's the winter control, it's the dust control, and then the surface treatments that are required on those roads. So there's a lot to maintaining the road network that the city has. And to further add to that, if we think back to the chart on the tax comparisons, where we saw Toronto having the lowest taxes, This chart's not to demonstrate, obviously Toronto is more dense than we are. It's not to say we should be like Toronto, but to put into context that earlier I mentioned that the city has spent about $72 million rehabilitating 700 kilometers of roads. So that's about $100,000 per kilometer. And if you look at this slide, the City of Toronto has about 80 homes per lane kilometer of road. So if you divided that $100,000 cost to those 80 homes, a City of Toronto resident would pay about $1,250 to maintain that 1 kilometer of road. When you get to Peterborough, not as dense as Toronto, they have about 37 homes per kilometer. So that same $100,000, the cost divided into that, about $2,700. You get to Kawartha Lakes, where we have this massive road network that we just talked about. We only have 7 households per kilometer. So you divide $100,000, the cost to maintain a kilometer of road, what we've traditionally been spending over the last 4 years, and divide it by those 7 homes. That's a cost of over $14,000 per home. So when we hear our roads aren't being maintained, perhaps as well as they should be, the message there is it's an affordability issue. So we have maintained 700 kilometers of road. That's a lot. But when you look at just the massive road network that we have and the affordability of being able to maintain it, it's a tough message. And so I think that this council has done an admirable job in making roads a priority. And we'll see that further when we look at the 2022 budget. The other comment we get is about salaries and the portion of salaries that make up our budget. And you'll see later on that it's still consistently around 30% of our total budget goes towards salaries. And so in the previous chart that we looked at, that was a comparison of 40 other municipalities, that chart was easy to look at. It included education in the upper or lower tier, so it was a good comparison. I stripped out of that list the 14 single-tier municipalities, so offering similar services to what we offer. And you can see here that salaries in Kawartha Lakes are actually not that large of a portion of our taxes or of our budget relative to our comparators. So we're roughly around 30% of our total budget operating budget goes towards salaries. So the other comment we hear is, we've been driving about a $3 million surplus, and so why don't we just not raise taxes as much and not have that $3 million surplus? And so this council has made the decision in both 2018 and 2020. The use of the surplus went towards the capital reserve, which in turn goes into the capital program, which is predominantly spent maintaining roads. In 2019, the $3 million surplus, council used that to allocate it towards community-related pandemic initiatives. We'll talk a little bit later about how that $3 million was spent. But I think it's important. $3 million is a large number, but it's not as large in the context of our budget. It's about 1.3% of our total tax-supported budgets, operating and capital. If I compared that to the average household in Kawartha Lakes, so I looked at what the average income is for a home in Kawartha Lakes, and effectively our $3 million surplus would be the equivalent of a household having about $800 of discretionary money that they could spend on something other than managing their house, so paying their taxes and their bills and putting food on the table and paying for their car, all of those sorts of things. Our $3 million surplus works out to about $800 to the average home. So just to put that number into context. And then finally, the thing we hear a lot about is the city's debt, that the city has a lot of debt. And it's important to put that into context as well. So the province actually prescribes the maximum amount of debt that the city can incur at any point in time. And we are significantly below that. And we've had that conversation with council recently. We do have about $140 million in debt, But it's important to remember that that's supporting $3.5 billion of assets. So that factoring in all the city's facilities, the roads, the sewers, all of our infrastructure is valued at about $3.5 million that we have to maintain. And so again, big numbers, but if we strip that down to a household, our $140 million of debt would be the equivalent of a home valued at $475,000, having a mortgage on that house of $20,000. So again, just to put it into context, 140 million is a big number, but when you strip it down to sort of a household context, it's not as large as it seems. So we'll flip now and start to talk a little bit about the pandemic and response and recovery. I don't think that any of us would have predicted that we'd talk about this 2 budgets in a row, but here we go. So in 2020, as I mentioned earlier, Council approved that the 2019 surplus of $3 million, slightly less than that, be directed towards community pandemic recovery initiatives. And there's some key initiatives that Council chose to use that money towards. So we had the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Recovery Fund framework. There was a community pandemic recovery group as well. They came up with a framework of how to spend some of that money. There were some enhanced services provided to our downtown areas, our parks and gathering areas. We wanted to make sure residents attending those spaces would be safe. There was an infusion of funding towards the 50/50 community program. We made some improvements to a number of boat launches, again, recognizing we wanted to get residents out and doing things. And then finally, took advantage of those funds to be able to advance the reconstruction of Colburn Street in Fenland Falls. So on top of that, the city received $7 million in Safe Restart funding from the federal and provincial government. And these funds were intended to support municipalities in continuing to provide those municipal services throughout the pandemic. We obviously had some financial pressures as well. And so to date, we've spent almost all of that money. There's $400,000 left. But we've used that money towards providing protective equipment to our first responders. We've provided some additional technology supports to ensure we could have continuity of services. And the key thing that Council chose to do with that money was to use it to offset the costs related to the pandemic and lost revenues that we were incurring to make sure that we could keep the tax levy down. And that was really the key driver for why we were able to put in a 1.5% tax levy increase last year. The $7 million in Safe Restart money really was the funds that were sort of provided to us uncommitted from the province and the federal government. On top of that, we did receive a lot of pandemic funding specific to paramedics, to transit, to long-term care, for homelessness shelters. Those funds were committed for very specific purposes, but I wanted to highlight how Council chose to spend these dollars that we received. So now that we've recapped some of the key initiatives of the Council over this term and talked about how we've managed with pandemic, we'll move into the 2022 proposed budget. And we'll give an overview. There's 3 key budgets that the city deliberates each year. There's the operating budget. That's the costs of delivering the 200+ services, those ongoing costs. So if you think of that in the context of your home, that's, you know, paying your mortgage and your hydro bill and all those sorts of things, your groceries, that would be your operating cost. The capital costs, our capital budget is one-time in nature, and it's those improvements that result in the creation of an asset. So that in the context of a home would be buying a new car or putting a roof on your house, a new furnace, that sort of thing would be capital. And then the special projects budget is one-time in nature, but it doesn't result in the creation of an asset. And so a good example of that from a household perspective would be if you had a child going off to university or college and that's an additional expense that you had, I guess it creates an asset and your child comes back home new and improved, but it's not a traditional asset. And so that's our special projects budget. And so then our budget from there, now that we know about operating, capital, and special projects, on the property tax supported budgets, we have all three of them. And that's not to say property tax is the only support to those budgets, but it's the key support. And then on our water and wastewater side, these are the water bills and wastewater bills that get paid. There's both an operating and a capital budget associated with those. So the total proposed 2022 budget is just shy of $300 million. And the pie is showing how that $300 million is comprised. So the largest component is the operating budget at $221 million. We have a property tax supported capital budget at 38.7. Our special projects budget that's property tax supported at 2.3 million. And then the water and wastewater budgets in the yellow and green, the operating side at 24 million and the capital budget at 9.7. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those budgets individually. So we'll start with our capital budget for 2022. Again, the proposed budget is 38.7 million. And to put that into context, we talked earlier about the city having $3.5 billion in assets. And so really that's an investment of about 1% of the value of our assets. And we're currently working on a long-range financial plan with council with the plan to put that up to about 2%. So it's you know, as much as it's a large capital budget, it's not large in the context of the amount of assets that we're trying to maintain. And so this pie chart shows you how that $38.7 million is being allocated. The bulk of it, more than 50%, is going to roads and the related infrastructure like street lights, bridges, culverts, that sort of thing. And then you can see from there the other little less than 50% is the remainder of our capital program. Transit and fleet at 5.6 million, landfills at a little less than $1 million, emergency services almost 3 million, our parks at 1.4 million, IT infrastructure at $1.5 million, building and facilities at 1.3 million, and finally our recreation and library facilities at 4.4 million. How that 38.7 million gets funded, the pie walks you through the various reserves and funding sources. I can talk a little bit about some of them. Development charges comes from development, growth within the community. The developers pay development charges. Those monies are then used to pay for any growth-related infrastructure. Gas tax reserves, money that we get from the federal government on an annual basis. Those funds are a bit restricted in what we can do with them, but we make use of those funds every year. Community partners and other municipalities, that's generally around bordering infrastructure that we need to put in place, a small portion of our budget. And the balance, what you see there is reserves, the capital reserve, other reserves, the fleet reserve, and even debenture. Those are tax supported. You know, we get debenture money that comes in, but the payment and repayment of that is tax supported. So a little more than about 60% of our capital budget is actually funded through the taxpayer in one way or another. Some highlights for this capital budget, again, that's proposed. There's the rehabilitation of 173 kilometers of roads. We're looking to design a new paramedic headquarters and fleet center. There's the replacement of the Lindsay Recreation Complex ice pads, and then a myriad of other projects that are really about just the ongoing repair and maintenance of the city's assets. So with each budget, there's always a list of projects that have to be deferred, either due to funding constraints and just really maintaining affordability to the residents. This year in our capital budget, or in our budget book, if you wanted to look it up, it starts on page 177. And there's a list of about almost $17 million worth of projects that we just can't get to this year. And those are accumulation of projects that we really just had to reprioritize for this year. And when we do our long-range financial plan, We're really looking to make sure we can close that gap and not have that list continue to grow. And we do in investing more money into our capital, being able to get rid of that list. It also then helps us save money on the other side of not having to do emergency procurements as those investments start to fail. So the long-range forecast does anticipate that this list would grow exponentially, and so this council's made some decisions to try and help reduce that gap and put some significant funding into our capital program. And so in doing that, we've got direction to implement a 1.5% dedicated tax levy to support the capital program. So if you think back to a few slides ago, more than 50% of that capital program is roads, the rest of it throughout the city. But that 1.5% tax levy increase equates to about a $35 cost per average household. And so those funds would be dedicated 100% to going towards building our capital program, making sure we're keeping our assets in good state of repair. And it equates to about $2 million across the city. So we'll move into the operating budget. This is again the component of the budget that helps us run our day-to-day. And so this budget sits at about $221 million. The slide shows how those funds are allocated to the various components. Salaries and benefits at just less than 75 million, that 30% of our budget that we talked about earlier when we did the comparison slide. Transfers to external clients is the next largest component at 46.8 million. And that's largely funded through our human services, where we get funding that comes in from the province that we then distribute to provide various services. So that's a good component of that money, or that budget, as well as the OPP budget sits in there. So our cost of our policing service sits there. Under contracted services at 43.7 million. That's things like waste collection, the winter control, and maintaining our roads. And the other key component in there would be our long-term care facility, Victoria Manor, is managed by a third party, and so our costs associated with managing that home would sit there. The transfer to reserves, 24.1 million. As we saw in the capital budget, a lot of it gets funded through reserves, and so this is our ability to put money into reserves to help pay for those expenditures that need to happen on the capital side. Materials, supplies, and services is at slightly less than $17 million. And that would be things included in that budget would be things like utilities and fuel, be the salt and sand that we put on our roads, vehicle maintenance. Obviously, there's a myriad of other things, but those just a highlight to give you a sense of what's in that budget. Debt and financial is exactly what it looks like. That's primarily the cost of servicing our debentures, so the principal and interest on those funds. And then $3.8 million of our budget is other miscellaneous things. So how we fund that $221 million in our operating budget, the bulk of it is funded through property taxes. We're proposing for 2022, that would be about $130 million. Grants is the next largest component at $55.5 million. User charges, 27.7, and then other at 7.8. And we'll walk through in detail, a little bit more detail, the taxation and the grants budget. So the $130 million in tax dollars, how does that get spent? This pie shows you where those dollars go. Not probably surprising, the largest component is public works, and that's where we have our road maintenance and waste collection would be the two key components in that budget. Next largest portion of the pie is emergency services. That would be our police, paramedics, and fire services. And that really, those two services make up more than half of our budget alone. 10% of the budget goes towards contributing to the capital and special projects budget, again, maintaining those assets. Community services at 10%, so that would be our recreation facilities and parks. Libraries are about 2% of the tax dollar. Development services, which is our planning, building, and economic development department, they would be about 5%, so that's that group that's helping to drive the growth. Engineering and corporate assets at 2%, and they would be the division that's responsible for the bulk of the capital program. And human services at 11%. Again, they provide those critical services to our vulnerable population. So we also talked about grant funding at about $55.5 million. Grant funding is a tricky one. It's not always guaranteed. But you can see from this pie, the areas highlighted in blue, those are provincial grants that we get, and they make up about 87% of our $55.5 million. The pieces of the pie that are in the reddish tones make up about 10%. Those are funds that come from the federal government. And then 3% is monies that we get from other municipalities. So again, when we break that down, the largest component is human services. We get a lot of funding from the province that helps us flow through to provide those services to our residents in need. The Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund is a key one to highlight. Those funds are not guaranteed. There's been lots of conversation from the province about reducing that funding, and it's about $7 million to the City of Kawartha Lakes. And those funds are uncommitted from the perspective that we have the discretion of what to do with those funds, and currently we use it to help keep the tax levy down on an annual basis. Paramedic services, another key component of the pie. The operating costs associated with providing paramedic services is cost shared with the province, so that's what that's about. And then the other smaller pieces of provincial funding pertaining to aggregate resources, waste and recycling, Kawartha Lakes Police, provincial gas tax funding comes in to help pay for transit, and then there's another very small piece of the pie that's just miscellaneous provincial funding. We get into the red. The biggest component there is our federal gas tax funding, and those funds are used, again, primarily we put those funds towards roads. We get about $4.5 million a year. There's limitations on what it can be used for, but again, primarily the city chooses to put those funds towards roads. We also receive some federal funding, again, for human services, and then recovery from other municipalities, a small component. Again, that would be a cost-sharing opportunity generally that we have with other municipalities. So this year, some of the key drivers that we have impacting our budget, salaries and benefits at $2.1 million. That's a pretty consistent number year over year. We have 10 collective bargaining units with contractual obligations for cost increases there, and so that's what drives that. We're starting to see some pressures for some new positions. So there's some costs in this tax-supported budget of about $1.4 million. There's some culvert maintenance that needs to happen that sits in the operating budget, about $600,000, and then there's some increased debt payments this year of about $400,000. So that's there's obviously other things that are driving the budget, but those are sort of the key significant ones. So we are proposing a tax levy increase of 3% for this year, and the budget that you've just seen on operating incorporates that. And it's important to understand that the increase is the change in the budget from one year to the next. It's not necessarily the increase that residents will see on their tax bill. And the reason for that, if you think way back to when I showed the comparison chart where we had Kawartha Lakes listed twice, residents in this community have area rated taxes, and so it really depends on where you live and which area rates you pay will determine what your tax bill will be, along with, you know, the assessed value of your home. There's a myriad of equations that go into that, and so we're not able to individually say what your tax levy increase is going to be on a home until we get to that point of getting ready to issue tax bills. So the last tax-supported budget is the special projects budget. And this was, again, a budget that this council decided to create, and it's for those one-time in nature expenditures that are not don't create an asset. So generally, the city uses this budget to fund information technology and plans and studies. Change for 2022 is we have a lot of annual maintenance programs. In Parks and Recreation's a key one, where every year there's initiatives to maintain a park, as an example. And we used to have that sitting in this special projects budget, and we've made the decision this year that it's probably better suited for the operating budget. The transparency will still be there. You'll hear from that director at budget time how he plans to spend those dollars. But for stability of this budget, we felt it was better to move it back to the operating budget. So if we look, the special projects budget's the smallest of the city budgets at $2.3 million. At the top chart, you see the expenses are really split into two categories. So plans and studies is the bulk of it at $1.7 million. And some information technology brings up the balance of that budget. And then the bottom chart shows how that budget is funded, primarily from tax levy at $1.8 million, and a little bit of funding from development charges and some other reserves. Some highlights from this year's special projects budget. The city has been investing over the last couple of years into a cell gap initiative with the Eastern Ontario Rural Network. And so included in this budget is our final year of investment in that. There's some improvements for technology and applications around ensuring efficiency and providing enhanced service. And then there's lots of plans and studies, but most notably there's 2 environmental assessments and the transportation master plan. So that is the conclusion of our tax-supported budget. The next budget we'll get into is the operating and capital budget related to water and wastewater. And this is for those residents in the city that are connected to our water system or wastewater system. You get your bill every quarter. This budget is what those dollars are going towards. So the operating budget for water and wastewater, $24.1 million. And really it's split, as you can see, $13 million is what we anticipate to receive through water consumption, the bills that come in, the funds that come in for that. $8.7 million is the wastewater user charge. Again, when you get your wastewater bill, we anticipate receiving about $8.7 million over 2022. And then other revenue of $2.4 million, miscellaneous things, new water connections, and things of that nature. The capital budget for water and wastewater is $9.7 million. And you can see it's split almost 50-50 between the treatment side of the system and the collection and distribution side of the system, a small portion being allocated towards studies and special projects. The capital budget of $9.7 million is being funded primarily from reserves, which is really those, when you're paying your water and wastewater bill, those funds are coming in. We're allocating money to reserves to be able to maintain that underground infrastructure that's needed to deliver the water to your home and take the other stuff away. There's a $3.2 million debenture that's required in this capital program, and a small portion, a little less than $1 million coming from development charges. So in this proposed budget for water and wastewater, we do hire a consultant every 5 years to review our costs associated with the system. They review a 10-year plan and provide us with a rate study. That study was adopted by council earlier this year, and it proposed a 3% increase in the water and sewer rates for this year. And this plan, this budget that we've got presenting this year is consistent with that. And so next steps. Tonight we're holding the public meeting to give some information, or the meeting for the public to hear about our budget. On November 30th, council will deliberate the capital budget, followed by December 7th, council will deliberate and approve the balance of our budgets, the operating budget, special projects, and water and wastewater budget. And so you as a resident, how you can get involved, If you follow us at kawarthalakes.ca/budget, you'll find out more about the meetings. Our budget book is there, as well as any presentations that we provide to council. Everything gets loaded up there that you can watch it. And there you can also subscribe at kawarthalakes.ca/subscribe. And that, Mayor Letham, concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much. Well done, good presentation. I'm just going to get a motion to receive, and then we'll see if there's any questions. Moved by Councillor Richardson, second by Councillor Ashmore. Are there any questions for Jennifer on the presentation? We're not really looking for detailed budget questions, obviously. We'll deal with that later, but is there any clarification or questions that Council's looking at for in anything that came up in the presentation? Councillor Richardson, go ahead.
Thank you, and through you. Yes, just maybe, can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Just maybe a little bit of clarification. I know we talked about the 1% value that we have on right now to maintain our assets. And I'm glad to hear that we're going to be moving to that 2% margin just because of our aging assets. Plus, I mean, we have the changes in accessibility in some of our buildings coming up as well. So I was wondering, when are we implementing that 2%?
Go ahead.
Through the mayor, the 1.5% increase that we're proposing for this year, that's the dedicated capital levy, that over a 10-year window will help us get to that 2%.
So that would be 1.5% per year over the next 10 years is what's being proposed, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Okay. Councillor Dunn, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jennifer, just for the benefit of the public, can you talk about urban roads and rural roads and the funding? How I bumped into a fellow today on the way to the meeting, and Lindsay gets everything. We get all the good roads, and the rural roads are dying, and so on and so forth. Do you want to give us some comments on that?
Sure, I will do my best on that. Earlier in the presentation, I talked about council having spent $72 million over this term of council, 700 kilometers of roads. That included all roads, so it was gravel resurfacing, it was urban roads, it was rural roads, it was all of the roads. And I would be happy to provide a breakdown of that. We can put it on the website, or I can include it in our capital budget presentation on November 30th if we want that breakdown.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Ashmore, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Director Stover. Thanks for the presentation. Have we looked into calculating the effects of inflation this year on our operating and capital budgets and wastewater budget, water and wastewater budget? Have we put that inflation adjustment into it, or are these figures based on current projections?
Not 100% clear on what you're asking, but I'll give my best shot at it, and then you can tell me if I've answered your question, Councillor Ashmore. So when we prepare the budget, we're standing here today, it's middle of November. Staff have been working on this budget since probably June, and we do look at what our budget was in 2021, what inflationary costs are, what our contractual obligations are, and we adjust the budget as we need to. But we're always mindful of trying to find efficiencies so that if we don't need to increase the budget, we don't. But in short, yes, we've factored in increased costs into our budget, and that would be part of the driver.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions for Jennifer? Come on, Councillor Elmsley, you got to have a budget question. You got to have something in there.
The only one I would ask, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, is when we talk about debt, Director, a lot of our debt is held by the city, but it's not actually paid by the city. And I'm referring to things like the new social services building and some of the water and wastewater debt and that type of thing, where it is either the province or the user, and the same with Halliburton Kawartha Housing Corporation, the debt that's held there shows as city debt, but in actual fact, it's going to be paid over a number of years by either the province, the feds, users, or whomever. Could you just speak to that for a minute, please?
Yes, through the mayor, the answer is correct. The city does have not just debt that we've incurred. We take on the debt for the Kawartha Lakes Halliburton Housing Corporation. They in turn get revenues and get funding from province and other sources. And so all of those things get factored in, but from a pure accounting perspective, we have to assume that a city debt, but it is not all tax levy supported, and the taxpayer is not the one who's paying for all of that debt. You're correct.
Thank you.
So it shows up as the city's debt, but on the other side, it's showing up as revenue for any of those sources, whether it's coming from the province or from the user groups. Rental for those facilities is showing up as a revenue against an incurred city debt, correct?
Correct.
Right, thank you. Councillor Richardson, did you have a follow-up? Yep, go ahead.
I did, just something jogged my mind there. Thank you again, Director Stover, a great presentation. I just kind of wanted to refer back to a couple of your first slides. I mean, you know, cost of doing business has gone up, and with inflation, and of course we have probably more people in the area, so you have those pressures where we're going to have to add staff and additional services to cover off the, you know, the growth in the area. Just maybe a comment through you or CAO regarding, you know, you look at our wages and then you look at us at 200 plus services and you look at the size of our municipality. I think we're doing pretty good. And I just, you know, if you could, you know, make a comment maybe towards, you know, another municipality, just showing that, you know, the city of Kawartha Lakes has a good round service for the size of it. I don't know if anybody else had any, you know, other municipalities you could back it up to.
Yeah, so through the mayor, great comment, Councillor Richardson. So I did have this slide. I don't know if Kathy, if you can pop that up again, that shows that the city really does have low salaries relative to our total budget, and ultimately our total budget is to fund those 200 plus services. So we do have low salaries. There is some pressure this year, as I mentioned. We're starting to see a need to add staff, and that's not surprising. We're starting to see growth happening out in the community. And really what happens with growth is it's sort of a staggered approach to where the pressures come on. So growth starts to happen. There's a lot of pressure in our engineering and development services department as they start to ready for that growth and get the infrastructure in place. And then as the residents start to move in, we see some pressures in other areas. Our admin areas will start to have a need, and then as the community evolves, then you've got things like Parks and Rec, those sorts of pressures. But the pressures get staggered on. We've got we'll have more roads to maintain. We'll have a greater need for emergency services, and so we will see our staffing costs go up. But we're very, very low today. And I don't anticipate, even with adding those pressures on, that we're going to see our numbers change drastically from where they are right now.
Okay. Last call for questions. Seeing none, we have a motion to receive. I'll call the question. All in favor? And that's passed. Thank you. Item 5 is deputations relating to the 2022 budget for the City of Kawartha Lakes. Sarah, do we have any deputations signed up? We have none. Item 6 is correspondence relating to the 2022 budget for the City of Kawartha Lakes. Sarah, have we received any correspondence? We have not. Thank you. Item 7 is a confirming bylaw, a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the special council meeting of November 18th, 2021. If I can get a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Elmsley, seconded by Councillor Vale. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. And that ends our public meeting or special council meeting to deal with an overview of the budget. So just a motion to adjourn, please. Councillor Dunn, seconded by Councillor Elmsley. All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. And we are adjourned. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, Jennifer, for your overview. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you on November 30th.